Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to Center Island, New York,
Hmm.
2018, and we're going to look into the death of James Copala.
Sounds intriguing already.
It is, and it's we're going to be using police reports, witness statements,
Oh, wow.
court transcripts, the whole nine yards.
Okay.
So this is a case where a fire revealed a lot more than just an accident.
Yeah, those are always the most interesting.
So this is a tangled web of secrets and lies, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of what happened to James Copala.
Well, I'm ready to dive in.
So are we. So to set the scene a little bit, this all started with a fire at the Copala family's vacation home.
Okay. Vacation home. So already we're talking about
Affluence.
Yeah.
But the thing is, James Copala, the man who was found dead inside, he didn't die from the fire.
Oh, okay. So right off the bat, we know this is suspicious.
Very suspicious. He was dead before the fire even started.
Wow. So how does a successful businessman, husband, and father end up dead in his own vacation home before a fire even starts? I mean,
Right. It's the million-dollar question, or in this case, maybe the multi-million-dollar question.
yeah.
So first responders, they found his body just inside the doorway, and they noticed something was off right away.
What was it?
The floor beneath him was totally pristine, untouched by the fire. It's like something out of a movie, right?
Yeah, you see that in the movies.
So right away, it was pretty clear that this was no accident. Someone set that fire deliberately, and they brought in an arson dog, Leah, and sure enough,
Leah found something?
traces of accelerant.
Wow. So arson and a body?
And we don't even know how he died.
That's right. The medical examiner's initial ruling only deepened the mystery. They ruled his death a homicide,
Okay.
but by unspecified means. And that's pretty rare, you know? It means that they knew he was murdered, but they couldn't figure out exactly how at that point.
So we've got a fire, we've got a dead body, and we have no cause of death. This is where things start to get really interesting. So who was this James Copala? What do we know about his life?
Well, on the surface, James had it all. Successful businessman, seemed to have a comfortable life, wife, children. He did have a history of heart problems, even had a pacemaker, but that wouldn't explain, the arson
Right.
or any of the other suspicious circumstances surrounding his death.
Right. I mean, it seems like the perfect life, right? At least from the outside. But we all know things aren't always as they appear. So were there any cracks in this facade?
Well, investigators started digging and they found something that suggested maybe there was some turmoil in James's personal life.
Oh.
He'd had a long-term extramarital affair.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah. And while the family claimed it had ended years ago, that James had reconciled with his wife, you have to wonder if there were any lingering resentments.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, affairs can leave some pretty deep scars. So did investigators think that maybe someone connected to this affair wanted James dead?
They were definitely considering it.
Yeah.
Especially when they found another clue at the crime scene.
Okay, what's that?
James, he always wore these very specific pieces of jewelry,
Okay.
2 gold chains with charms,
Okay.
and a Rolex watch.
Mm-hmm.
These items were missing from the scene.
Okay. So now it's looking like a possible robbery, too.
Right, exactly. So now you have 2 potential motives.
Revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Or just, a straight-up robbery.
Straight up robbery.
So did they start looking for somebody who had, a grudge against James, maybe someone who knew about the affair?
They were looking into all of that, but then they got a lucky break.
Okay.
Remember, we're talking about Center Island. This is a very small, very affluent community. Not a lot of outsiders coming and going.
Right.
So when they reviewed surveillance footage and spotted a taxi arriving and leaving the island, right around the time the fire alarm went off, that really caught their attention.
Yeah, I bet. Because in a place like that, a taxi would stick out like a sore thumb. So it wouldn't be too hard to track down, I imagine.
No, they tracked down the taxi company, got the name of the passenger, and guess who it was?
Oh, I have a feeling I know.
Jennifer Gross,
The ex-girlfriend.
the former girlfriend, James's former girlfriend.
Wow, so the affair wasn't as over as the family claimed.
Seems that way.
So this Jennifer Gross, what do we know about her?
Well, she was about as far from the Coppola's world of wealth and privilege as you could get.
Oh, okay.
Jennifer was struggling financially, bouncing between hotels, short-term rentals. Investigators learned that James had actually been helping her out financially, even after the affair had supposedly ended.
So maybe money was a motive.
Yeah, they were definitely considering that, especially when they dug a little deeper into Jennifer's past. Just 2 months before the fire, she had been arrested.
For what?
stealing James's car, some money, his passport from that Center Island house. Oh, yeah. And here's the kicker. At the time of his death, James actually had a restraining order against her.
Okay, so we've got a former girlfriend who's struggling financially, has a history of stealing from James, and there was a restraining order in place. It started to look like maybe Jennifer is at the center of all of this.
It sure does.
But was it just a robbery gone wrong, or was there something more sinister going on?
That is the question, isn't it? And that's what investigators were trying to figure out as they started digging into Jennifer's story.
So we've got this ex-girlfriend, she's in financial trouble, history of stealing, restraining order. Like, where do they go from here? Do they bring her in?
Oh, they brought her in, all right.
Right.
But she wasn't exactly helpful, let's just say. At first, she tried to play it cool, said she was nowhere near Center Island when the fire happened, claimed she was all the way in Rochester, even tried to spin this crazy story about the mafia being involved in James's death.
The mafia? Come on. That's a little far-fetched, don't you think? Even for this case.
Yeah, investigators weren't buying it for a second. They were already watching her, knew she was lying about being in Rochester. Plus, they got her phone records, and guess what? They placed her right on Center Island the night of the fire.
Oh, she messed up there. So they catch her in a lie, her phone records put her at the scene of the crime, and she's making up these ridiculous stories. What was her explanation for all of this?
Well, instead of coming clean, she just kept digging that hole deeper. Started calling the police, pretending to be someone else, trying to get information about the investigation.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's pretty brazen. I mean, it's also super risky.
Yeah, and it totally backfired. Just made the investigators even more suspicious. They still didn't have enough to charge her with murder. You know, the medical examiner couldn't say for sure how James died. But they did have enough to arrest her for violating that restraining order and for stealing James's jewelry.
So they used those charges to pressure her, trying to get her to talk. So what happened when they finally got her in that interrogation room?
Well, it was a long and winding road to the truth. At first, Jennifer, she tried to present this image of her and James as this loving, supportive couple, said he was her main source of income, that he was always there for her, her kids.
So, like, she was trying to create this picture of a happy reunion, like, oh, we were back together. There was no reason for me to want him dead. He was taking care of me.
Exactly. She even went as far as to say that she found James distraught, maybe even suicidal on the night of his death, tried to point the finger at his wife, Barbara, said maybe she had something to do with it.
Oh, man. Blaming the grieving wife? That's low. It sounds like she was just grasping at straws, trying to come up with anything to get the heat off of her.
It was a desperate attempt to control the narrative, but the problem was her story kept changing. One minute she's saying James asked her to leave because he had some things to handle. Then she's claiming he had a heart attack and she panicked. She even suggested that maybe he faked his own death, ran off with a bunch of money.
Wow, she was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. It's like the more she talked, the deeper she dug that hole.
Exactly. And investigators, they weren't falling for it. They kept poking holes in her timeline, questioning why she would steal his jewelry, arrange a taxi before he supposedly died. They could sense she was lying.
So did she finally crack? Did she confess to having something to do with James's death?
Well, she did, but it wasn't this clear-cut confession. Like, in a moment of frustration, she admitted to hitting James with a frying pan during an argument, said he died from the blow. But that didn't really line up with the medical examiner's findings. There was no evidence of any significant head trauma.
Okay, so a confession, but the details don't quite add up. What did investigators do with that?
They knew they had to keep pressing her. This could be the key to unlocking the truth. And finally, after hours of questioning Jennifer's facade, it just crumbled.
This is where things get really interesting. The truth finally comes out.
Yeah. Jennifer confessed to what really happened that night. In a fit of rage, after James refused to give her more money, she repeatedly hit him with that frying pan, and then she admitted to setting the fire to try and cover up what she did.
So we have a motive, money, and we have a confession. Seems like an open and shut case now, right? Was that confession enough to secure a murder conviction?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But even with a confession, things weren't that simple. There were still some hurdles for the prosecution to overcome.
Who do you mean? I mean, she confessed.
Well, they still had to prove the exact cause of death. Remember, the medical examiner ruled it a homicide, but by unspecified means, so they had to connect Jennifer's actions directly to James's death to get a murder conviction.
Oh, I see. So just because she admitted to hitting him doesn't automatically mean that's what killed him.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else made this case so difficult?
Well, Jennifer's constantly changing story. That was a big problem. A good defense attorney could easily point out all those inconsistencies, cast doubt on her credibility, create reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury. It wouldn't be a slam dunk case for the prosecution.
So even with the confession, it wasn't a sure win. Sounds like the prosecution had a tough decision to make.
They did. Jared Rosenblatt, he was the prosecutor handling the case. He had to weigh the need for justice against the potential trauma of a trial. Not just for Jennifer, but for the Copala family too. They had already been through so much, losing James, their home destroyed, then this whole affair coming out.
It's just heartbreaking to think about what that family was going through.
Yeah.
Did they even want to go through a trial, to have to relive all that pain in such a public way?
They didn't. They just wanted it to be over, for Jennifer to be held accountable. They didn't want their lives, their private lives, dissected in court.
So the prosecution, they had to balance the family's wishes with their duty to get justice. So what happened? Did they decide to go to trial?
After a lot of back and forth, and with the Coppola family's input, Jared offered Jennifer a plea deal.
A plea deal.
She could plead guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, which is a lesser charge than murder, and in exchange, she wouldn't have to go to trial.
So it was a compromise.
Huh?
She wouldn't be convicted of murder, but she'd still face a serious sentence. Did she accept?
She did. Jennifer Gross pled guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, and she was sentenced to 22 years in prison.
22 years. That's a long time. Do we know how the Coppola family felt about the outcome? Were they satisfied?
They were given the opportunity to speak at her sentencing, and I can't imagine how difficult that must have been to face the woman who took James from them. They talked about their grief, about how much her actions had hurt them, and they spoke directly to Jennifer, holding her accountable for what she'd done.
That must have been an incredibly powerful moment in the courtroom.
It was incredibly poignant. Obviously, nothing could bring James back or take away the pain they felt. But that plea deal, it gave them a sense of closure, allowed them to move on without the added trauma of a trial.
Yeah. Sounds like the best possible ending to such a horrible tragedy. Justice was served and the family was spared further pain.
In a way, yes. But this case, it raises some important questions that linger even after the gavel falls, questions about desperation, conflict, and what justice truly means.
You're right. This case is about so much more than just a fire and a crime and a conviction. It really makes you think about the complexities of human behavior and how, things in society can lead to such tragic outcomes. It's so easy to get lost in the twists and turns of a case like this. But you're right. There are some really big questions here. Questions that go way beyond just what Jennifer did. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this case, it's not just about one woman's bad choices, right? It shows us how badly financial desperation can push people to do extreme things.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Jennifer was totally dependent on James for money. She had her own struggles.
Right.
And then when he finally cuts her off, she must felt completely trapped, like there was no other way out.
And it makes you think about the systems we have in place, right?
Yeah.
For people who are struggling.
Yeah.
Could something have been done to help her before it got to this point, before she felt like she had to resort to something so drastic?
That's the big question. This whole case just shows how much we need a safety net, for people who are going through tough times, to help them before they get desperate. I mean, it's a reminder that we have to take care of each other. We have to address these systemic issues that lead to financial instability in the first place.
Totally. And another thing that really struck me was the unresolved conflict between them.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there was so much anger, so much resentment bubbling under the surface of their relationship, even though she tried to say that things were good between them. You could tell that those feelings were eating away at her. And they boiled over in the worst way possible.
It's like a textbook example of how if you don't deal with conflict, it just keeps growing. And it can lead to these really destructive outcomes. I mean, think about it. The affair, her relying on him for money, the restraining order, all of that just piled up,
Yeah.
More and more resentment building.
Yeah. It's really sad to think about. Like, what if they could have communicated better?
Yeah.
Maybe gone to therapy or something? Could they have prevented this?
It's impossible to know for sure. But it makes you think, doesn't it? About how important it is to deal with conflict in a healthy way.
It really does. I mean, this case is a reminder that we need to be honest with each other, to be empathetic, and to be willing to ask for help when things get tough. Because if you just bottle everything up, if you let that resentment build, it can lead to terrible consequences.
Good question about it.
And then there's the Coppola family. I mean, they lost their husband, their father, their home, and then they had to deal with the affair coming out, the details of his death being all over the news. It's awful.
I can't even imagine.
And it really shows how the impact of a crime like this goes way beyond just the victim. I mean, this family had to grieve so publicly, their whole world turned upside down.
And that plea deal, even though it gave them some closure, it didn't erase the pain.
Right. And it raises this big question, like, what does justice actually look like? I mean, is 22 years enough?
Yeah. Is any sentence enough to really address a loss like that?
Right.
Those are tough questions. The justice system, it's supposed to punish people who do wrong, but it can't fix the harm that's been done. It can't bring someone back. It can't erase the trauma. This case really makes us think about the limits of what the legal system can do.
It does. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Coppola case, what are some of the things you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think this case shows us a lot of things. Like it shows just how destructive financial desperation can be, and how important it is to address conflict before it gets out of control, and how the impact of violence goes so much further than just the immediate victim.
It also makes us question the systems we have in place to support people.
Right.
And it makes us think about what justice really means, in complicated situations like this.
Absolutely. It's one of those cases that stays with you and makes you think about your own life, your relationships, and your role in building a more just, more compassionate world.
I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive.
Yeah, of course.
It's been a fascinating look into a really complex case. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep thinking about this case, the questions we've talked about. How can we work to prevent things like this from happening? How can we make the world a better place?
Mm-hmm.
That's all for today. Until next time, stay curious and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.